Indeed, I work at Sotheby's Institute of Art. We have our own homemade book classification scheme. We recently completed a major update of this scheme. So I'm going to say a little about what we did and why. But firstly, something about who we are, because I think to work out what classification scheme might be suitable for a library, we need to know about that library's remit. So we're the library for a small independent college in London, mainly offering master's degrees, also shorter courses. And our speciality is very much the study of the art world rather than simply the art itself. And our students typically go on to work in a whole range of roles in the art world: gallerists, working for auction houses, curators, many other roles, on the whole, not as artists, not as art historians. So I think you could sum that up and say that within the network of art-focused colleges, we have our own particular niche. I'll also say something about our students. Could talk about them in many different ways. I've chosen to focus on nationality because this was an issue that came up relatively often as we were working on the reclassification. So these are our top countries in terms of where our students come from. This is from the last 3 years. I believe here things have changed rather because of the pandemic. So China was in number 2 position before that for quite a while, and the UK was a few points below that. And clearly how things are going to shake out after the pandemic is anyone's guess. So I mentioned that we updated our book classification scheme. So what were the aims of this? Well, there were many small things to sort out, but really 2 major aims. I'm not sure what order to put them in, but this is how I put them on this screen here. One aim, to give equal weight to art from all parts of the world. So the old version of our book classification scheme treated European art as the default. So for example, a book about European painting used to be classified in a section called painting in general, while a book about Indian painting would be in a section called something like Indian painting. Now, our students between them are interested in art from pretty much the whole world and all time periods. So we wanted to change to what I'm going to call a decentered scheme. Now, this was definitely right for us, but I don't think it would be appropriate for all libraries. So, for example, if I was advising a library whose role was very specifically to offer resources about Indian art and culture, I would say make India your default, put India at your center, and all other countries can have a more marginal place in the classification scheme. So we did what was right for us. Now, the second major aim was to make it easier for students to find books, because in the old version of the scheme, they very often struggled and they would have to ask us for help. Now, when we look at these 2 aims, the first one fairly obviously relates to a diversity and inclusivity agenda. But I think the second one does as well. Because when we make it easier for students to find books, when we make it quicker for students to find books, we're benefiting all of them. But in particular, we're benefiting several groups of students who might be at a disadvantage in their studies. So for example, several groups of students for whom time is likely to be of the essence. So students with certain health problems, they may want to get hold of their books as quickly as possible so they can then head home and rest. Likewise, students with caring responsibilities, whether for children or for others, Students who are financially less well off and are having to do a relatively large amount of paid work to make their way through college. And then finally, I've put here a final group, not so much about time, but students who are shy about approaching library staff. And in my experience, when this happens, it's perhaps mainly a matter of personality, although possibly sometimes there are cultural factors that come in as well. Okay, so that's our main reasons for wanting to rework our classification scheme. Let's have a look at the scheme, beginning with what it looked like before. This is an example of a class mark. SCU, standing for sculpture, CHI, standing for China, MEN, an abbreviation for the author. Now, you might look at this and think, well, this looks pretty good. It's short, it's easy to imagine a library user pulling up the class mark on their phone and fairly easily being able to compare what they see on their screen with what they see on the spine of a book. And it's also rather intuitive. So again, we can imagine that library users, after they've spent a bit of time, they'll start to be able to work out what the class mark for a book will be. Now, all this is true, but nevertheless, there were problems. So, for example, the combination of elements SCU, CHI, could mean more than one thing. It could mean sculpture from China. It could mean sculpture by Chiida. And books in these two categories would be on different shelves, quite separate from each other. So in other words, the classification scheme was often failing at the most basic level in that it wasn't easily guiding the reader to the correct shelf. So we needed to make some changes. Now, this particular problem here was quite an easy one to fix. The older class marks are at the top of the screen, the newer ones lower down. We simply needed to add in some numbers. So in the final version of the scheme, 3 designated a topic in Asian art, 8 designated an individual, in this case, an individual sculptor. And into this scheme, we could insert a number for Europe as well. So Europe was no longer in a default section at the beginning, but sat alongside the other parts of the world. Now, this little fix was quite easy, but there were many things, other things we had to do with the classification scheme. And overall, these added up to a lot of time. So it's worth just pausing to consider, well, why did we choose to update the scheme we'd got rather than just switching to something like Dewey, which would have involved less brain power, less time? One important reason was that, as I hope I showed, the original version of the scheme did have some good points, which we wanted to preserve. And secondly, we didn't want to move to a general scheme because we wanted to be in control. And I'd like to highlight 2 reasons there. Firstly, as I mentioned, we're quite a niche college and therefore with a niche library. And we wanted to be in control so we could make sure that our scheme gave adequate representation for various specialist topics which are particularly important to us. So, for example, biennales, art fairs, curating theory, the economics of the art world. And a second major reason for wanting to be in control again comes back to diversity and inclusivity. Preferred language in this area changes frequently, concepts change frequently, people's needs and wishes change frequently. So by having a scheme where we're in control, we're in a position to act very quickly whenever it becomes apparent that changes are needed. Let me show you a little bit more of the new version of the scheme. This isn't a final version, but this is a draft. This is the fine art section. Fine art had always had the abbreviation FIA, which is maybe not too intuitive, but we decided to keep it because this is a very large section. And therefore, we were going to be working on it over quite a few months and changing things as we went along, we thought would cause too much confusion for our students, our library users. So this is an example of how the past is somehow always there and we can't simply get away from it necessarily. So this part of the scheme, it follows two principles which are common to many book classification schemes and probably other kinds of taxonomies as well. Firstly, it proceeds from the general to the increasingly specific. So the first section at the top, FIA 1, that's for books which are not limited to a particular time period, nor are they limited to a particular part of the world. And then jumping right down to the end to FIA 8, the most specific books of all, those books about one individual artist. And in between, books organized by time period, books organized by parts of the world. Now, I was taking the lead on this whole scheme, and I spent quite a bit of time wondering what order to put the parts of the world in. And I think there's probably no simple answer to this, and possibly there's no uncontroversial answer to this. This is just what I came up with. And it follows the second of the two principles, general principles for classification schemes, which is to move forward through time. So on this basis, we can be fairly sure that Africa is where humanity began. And it seems very likely that eventually the earliest art will be discovered in Africa. Though at the moment, I believe it's from Indonesia and pretty much simultaneously from Southern Europe. So, but Africa's got to go somewhere. Why not go there at the beginning? And similarly, we can be fairly sure that the last major landmass that human beings reached was the Americas, somewhere between 15 and 30,000 years ago. So the Americas, again, they've got to go somewhere. Why not put them there? And then the other parts of the world slotted in relatively logically. Now, having got this draft, we noticed a possible small problem, maybe not a huge one, but one we wanted to avoid. And that was with FIA 4, Asia and related parts of the world. And the potential problem was that the characters A and 4 are rather similar, and we wondered if there might be scope for confusion, perhaps for students who are scribbling down numbers in a hurry. And this seemed a potential issue we were particularly keen to avoid for the Asia section for two reasons. Firstly, it's a large section in our library. And secondly, we thought if this was going to be a problem, it might be particularly likely to be a problem for students whose first writing system is not the Latin alphabet. And in our college, that very often means our East Asian students, and they're quite big users of the Asia section. They're not the only users of it, and they're also big users of many other sections, but they're probably the main group looking at our Asian art section. So we wanted to avoid FIA 4 designating Asia. So what we did was we just did a little swap like this, swapping around Asia and Africa. Now, I've spent some time on this rather small tweak because I think it does illustrate two quite important things about how we approach this project. Now, firstly, it's a pragmatic scheme, so not aiming to come up with some kind of objective organization of knowledge, but really attending to the needs of our library users. And secondly, that includes thinking about and trying to anticipate the needs of specific groups of users. So, for example, in this case, students for whom their first writing system is not the Latin alphabet. Okay, so we got a scheme we were pretty much happy with. The next task was to fit the books into the scheme. Now, anyone who's done any classification will know this is an interesting process because authors very often refuse to write books on topics that fit neatly into the categories we create for them. This is an example of a book I spent quite a bit of time pondering. I imagine many of you know this book. It's called The Story of Art, but in many ways, The Story of European Art would be a better title for it because essentially that's what it is. Although, having said that, it does include some at least token coverage of art from many, many parts of the world, pretty much every continent, if I remember rightly. So a case could be made for classifying this as a book about European art. A case could be made perhaps for classifying it as a book about Western art in general, or a book about world art. Now, after a certain amount of dithering, I decided to put this in the world art section, even though it's not really adequate from that point of view by any means. And the reason I decided that was just because there are so few genuine global art histories. So to have at least a few titles in that section for people who were wanting that kind of general world history, I decided to put this book there, even though it's not really fully adequate to fulfilling that remit. Again, this is another decision I'd be very interested to hear about people's thoughts when we come to the Q&A. So, how do we make our decisions while working on the scheme? And what is a photo of Steve Jobs doing here? Well, he was apparently quite well known for not doing a lot of market research, not doing a lot of user testing. For example, when he was developing the iPhone, rather, he took the view that he was a human being, he knew what he wanted from a phone, and therefore other human beings were likely to want something similar. I think we could call this approach drawing on our common humanity. And I think indeed it does get us quite a long way. So, for example, if you consider the iPhone, very popular with all sorts of people of all ages, genders, all parts of the world. So that was probably our starting point in working on the classification scheme. But drawing on what I've called common humanity fails and can fail badly if we don't also consider the ways in which we are different. And in terms of a library, I'd like to highlight two things here. Firstly, I think we always need to keep in mind that as librarians, we have a body of professional knowledge that our library users generally don't have. And in terms of, say, the classification schemes we create, in terms of the language we use on our web pages, all the systems we create, we must make sure we're thinking about our users and not just ourselves. And secondly, one thing that in a college with a very international student body as we have, one thing that kept coming up was the range of cultural backgrounds, national backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds represented in the student body, and really wanting to make a scheme that worked for all of them as far as we could. So this required some empathy, some imagination, and we also undertook some consultation, both with students and with faculty. And the final major thing we were able to draw on while working on the scheme was many years of observing students in the library, what they found good or not so good about the classification scheme, many years of conversations with students. So all that fed into our planning. Here's a couple of examples of things we asked students about. And what we did was, if I remember rightly, I did all of this. When a question came up where I felt we needed input, I would simply grab a few students over a number of days, but making sure I was getting a reasonable sample in terms of students' national, cultural, linguistic background. So one question, for instance, was, well, where would you look for books on Leonardo? Would you look under L or under D or under V? And also, when we have to represent a century in a class mark, what form makes most sense to you? And these two questions, and I think most of the questions, interestingly, the answers were very consistent across the different groups of students. The first question I put here, the answer actually was very clear. It was Da Vinci. So, which surprised me, but I thought, okay, if that's what all our students want, that's what we'll go for. So Leonardo is under D for Da Vinci in our scheme. I'm wondering if any of you are slightly fainting with horror at that decision. That's what we've gone for. So how successful has all this been? Well, as soon as we started reclassifying sections of the library, it became apparent that students were needing to ask for help far less often. So this was a definite, very good result, freeing us up to help them in their studies in more interesting ways, more creative ways. Now, our other major aim that I've highlighted, what I've called a process of geographical decentering. As far as I'm aware, we have received no comments from anyone about this. And I guess this doesn't really surprise me because I suspect that the structure of book classification schemes on the whole is invisible to library users. Library users, they probably quickly find out where the sections live that they're interested in. They probably find out if their particular topics are easy to find or not to find. But in terms of the structure of the whole scheme, I think that that's probably often largely invisible. But nevertheless, I feel very happy that we did spend time and some effort on this part of the scheme, because even if people aren't noticing it, it's there in the background. I think we could say it's, as it were, operating in the unconscious of the library and of the college in a positive way.